don't you go ahead and talk a little bit?
Hi, my name is Kareem.
How do you pronounce your last name?
Kenyatta.
Kenyatta, okay. Just want to make sure I have that right. Okay. Alright. Get into my notes here.
Okay.
So I guess I'll take the first question one at a time.
Sure.
And then when I ask the question, if you could restate it. So when I ask what is marijuana reparations is, or do you have a preferred term for it? Is it cannabis reparations, war on drug reparations?
No, this is fine. Marijuana, cannabis.
Okay.
I use cannabis a lot, but
Yeah.
I think
Oh,
it's
really?
interchangeable.
You just have it on camera. Got
Got
him.
into that one.
Yes. All right. All right. Okay. So what is, okay, here we go. What is marijuana reparations?
So marijuana reparations refer to providing certain benefits and incentives to communities or members of a community that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. So in the business sense, where you see legalization take place, particularly in places like Oakland, they provide certain advantages to people who fall into a category of, if they live in certain communities or if they're at certain poverty levels, they can then have some type of advantage over other folks who haven't been as, harmed by the war on drugs.
I just heard a noise. I want to check. Make sure I'm not. Okay, we're still recording. Okay. I'll ask a little more basic question too.
Sure.
Why do you think certain communities were more harmed by the war on drugs?
Well, I think certain communities were probably more harmed just based off, when penalty enhancement legislation started sweeping the country. Unfortunately, the type of drugs that were targeted, I think it's clear by now, we all see that it had a disproportionate impact on certain communities where those drugs existed. And, when it comes to possession or distribution of narcotics, I think obviously you have open air drug markets in certain places. Other places, people are able to take drugs in the privacy of their own home. And so they don't have the same type of exposure to law enforcement. So I think that's a big part of, maybe, some people can argue there wasn't a certain race that was targeted, but by putting these policies in place, they definitely captured a certain population.
And I apologize if I throw a question at you that's not on the list, but they're coming to
Oh, no.
What role do you think that prosecutorial discretion has played in that disproportional impact?
Well, that's a good question, because prosecutorial discretion, I think that's one of the big arguments you have against the penalty enhancements, is because it takes away some of, not only the prosecutor but the judge's discretion to, if they see a case where they think someone may not be a chronic criminal or it may be their first interaction with the criminal justice system, if there is a law on the books in place that says this individual has to serve up to this amount of time, that discretion is removed. So I think there is kind of this negative connotation when it comes to prosecutors and judges that give out these sentences, but a lot of times it is based off the laws that are on the books. And I think you see, particularly in Illinois with the Black Caucus in particular, they have started to really focus on any penalty enhancement bill to say, unless it's, at this point, they don't want to have a penalty enhancement for any activity or behavior. So, that includes carjacking and other things, which other people feel like if you hijack someone's vehicle, you should serve time for that. But I think the Black Caucus and other members may approach it from the angle of more jail time, especially if you're younger, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to solve the problem of you becoming a criminal or, evolving into more of a criminal. Okay. I think there's an argument that less time, you may have the ability to rehabilitate if you aren't kind of a, just victim of the criminal justice system.
Okay. And does it cut the other way too, where prosecutorial discretion is used to go harsher after harsher penalties for certain communities, certain groups?
Sure. I mean, I think whenever it comes to prosecutorial discretion, it's an issue where we're all human beings, and I think there's always going to be certain bias when it comes to certain groups. Police officers, prosecutors, they see certain behavior all the time, and as a result of that, I'm pretty sure they do sometimes decide, this person is going to become, like I said, a criminal that continues to do damage to society. Mm-hmm. So it's my job to try to make sure that he or she is put away for a set amount of time to keep him out of society. So. Yeah, I'm sure it does cut that way too, where prosecutors probably, and I'm sure no one's correct all the time, and I'm sure there are people who get caught in that net that maybe they would have had a chance to rehabilitate, but a prosecutor decided, just based off his opinion or her opinion, that this person was a threat to society.
Okay. And getting back to the questions, why should Illinois legislators consider marijuana reparations policies?
Well, I think it's a twofold. That's a complicated question too, because when it comes to reparation policy, you have two schools of thought. One is if you broke the law at the time, whether we think cannabis or the use of cannabis should be illegal or not, we can't deny that up to, a few years ago on the medical side and in some places recreational, but it's just been over the past 5 or so years that we've started to change our view of marijuana and cannabis. So I think approaching it from that angle, reparations for people who broke the law then, some people feel like why should they get certain incentives and others don't. But the other side of that is when it comes to expungement, I think, and especially speaking for MPP, I think that's where we see kind of the reparations taking place. Not so much in giving a business advantage to certain groups, but, if we deem that marijuana and cannabis is, not as harmful as we once thought or shouldn't be treated the same way as other controlled substances, then someone, your criminal record probably should be expunged. If people are actually becoming multimillionaires based off selling the same product that locked someone up years ago, I mean, it'd be hard for me to sit here with a straight face and say that's a fair system. So, yeah, so I think it is twofold. If you're talking about reparations in the form of your criminal history should be expunged, I think that's a more kind of acceptable way of thinking of it. The reparations for people who actually kind of, broke the law and now they want to get into the cannabis business. I think that's a little trickier because, some people may say, why should they get an advantage when they knowingly broke the law at that point in time? So.
Now, there was a study recently that I saw, and again, throwing this out, that the war on drugs has had an impact close to $500 billion, both on the government but largely on the families of those who have been victims of the war on drugs. So should there, even setting aside the permitting process that Oakland has, should reparations at all touch on monetary reparations for those communities, maybe more investment in those communities, things like that?
Absolutely. I do think that's a big part of, and when I think of reparations, I think that is one of the key elements of it. Because, so for example, in the Illinois law, we're working with some of the community activists and social justice groups to create a program that, can restore communities. In fact, it's called Restore Our Communities. And basically, the point of it is to provide kind of local community discretion on how grant money is used in their areas, so they can come up with, because right now our statewide grant system is kind of a, it's a bureaucratic system, and you have to fill out, which there should be accountability and tracking and all that stuff. I'm not saying it shouldn't, but it doesn't always give you the flexibility you need to create the type of program that can help a community that has been more harmed by the war on drugs, because it's not a one-size-fit-all thing. What's good for East St. Louis may not be good for Peoria, or Peoria, what may be good there may not work in Chicago. So giving communities the ability to tap into money and funds that are the result of, cannabis sales, I think is in my opinion, it's a no-brainer, because you're giving back and trying to help restore a community that, needs help. And not only does that address kind of what the, past wrongs may have been, but it also creates, a more stable society going forward. And I think that's kind of an important piece.
Okay. Are there existing marijuana reparations policies that Marijuana Policy Project sees as models to copy?
Are there existing programs that MPP, or do you want me to say the whole thing, Marijuana Policy Project plans to copy? I think we're looking at, one of the main programs we're looking at is the Oakland Hood Incubator Program.
Okay.
And one of the things we really like about that is it gives, people the opportunity to learn more about the business, and gives them the skills to actually, get into the business and be successful once they enter it. It's no secret that across the country, the cannabis industry is not very diverse. And I think the Hood Incubator and programs like that try to address that by, it's not just saying, hey, we're going to give you a license just because, you've been in this community and things have gone wrong. It's more, let us give you the skill set to compete in a very competitive and regulated industry. Because in Illinois, for example, with the medical program, it's one of the most highly regulated programs in the country. And so in order for minorities or people who live in minority communities to be competitive in that space, you have to provide some type of, resources to kind of give them the ability to compete with someone who's kind of just been in business for 50 years and, they've run a highly regulated company. It's not just something you can up and do like overnight. So that's what we like about the Hood Incubator Program, that it provides those skills and provides folks with an opportunity to kind of enter into the industry.
Okay.
So.
And you've now mentioned Oakland a couple times, and you seem skeptical of the permitting process. Is there? And I just spoke with Otis Taylor, a columnist from there, and he also had some concerns about how it was executed. What are your thoughts on the Oakland the permitting part of reparations?
So, with the permitting process, you just mean in terms of people who are granted access to licenses?
Half of them are reserved for people, yeah.
Yeah, I think, going back to kind of the whole example of even in Illinois, what is good for one area may not be good for another area. I think Oakland obviously they're in a unique situation where, they were really, the war on drugs hit them particularly hard. And, I can see why there are people in that community that feel like they should have, certain advantages that other people don't, because they've been through a lot more. In Illinois, I think it's trickier. I'm not saying that I'm not trying to discount Oakland's concern, but I think from our perspective, one of the main things is making sure that people that were convicted for cannabis possession for whatever amounts, I think righting that wrong in terms of those people who were in possession of a product that we now deem is suitable for people, 21 years of age and older. I just think it's two different issues. And I can see the other side of the permitting process is, just to play devil's advocate, is why should, a certain group, no matter what's happened in the past, I think you also have a constitutional protection issue where you can't just necessarily give preference to one group or over another, because then you can, unintentionally create another form of discrimination. And I know if someone who heard this from Oakland may say, you're full of it, what do you mean? But I do think that's like one thing you have to balance out. Okay. Anytime you pick preferences for, a certain group of people over another, despite what the circumstances were that led up to that, I just think you have to be careful how you balance it out, because you could have a lot of unintentional consequences as well.
Would that include, if you didn't make it a racial
Sure.
aspect, or if you didn't make it a community by zip code or something, just by if you've had a conviction, would that even it out some? I mean, because there would still be, non-people of color who would have convictions
Sure.
and still be eligible. Would that even it out, or is it just you shouldn't have preferences?
Well, yeah, I just think it gets tricky. Yeah, even taking race out of it. I mean, so you have a conviction for something that at the time was illegal. And I'm just saying this from a perspective of, someone who may not, think that preference is the way to go in these situations. Even if we say now, it probably shouldn't have been illegal, that's different than the actual, at the time it was an illegal act. And so it's one thing to expunge that record and say, you know what, this shouldn't be held against you going forward.
Right.
But I think it's a whole nother argument to say you should be given preference because this happened to you.
Okay. So what, you've spoken on the expungement. So clearly MPP is planning to really push hard for expunging records of people convicted. Is that the only policy, or are there other policies that Marijuana Policy Project is backing?
Sure.
And why are you backing them?
Yeah, so MPP is also backing, on the industry side, helping people and giving people tools to actually get into the business. So, for example, one thing that we're looking at is creating a separate license for edible products, so the non-smokable products, because we found across the country, and I'll reference the Hood Incubator Program again, they have helped people like in terms of teaching them they want to start a delivery business or they want to start their own edible business. It's actually a lot of, on-ramps to get into the industry that don't necessarily require you to be to run a cultivation center or a dispensary. And so MPP is really, focused on trying to identify those types of opportunities to make the industry more inclusive and to make it more diverse. Obviously we want to also address kind of, if you want to become a cultivator, what can we do to kind of help get you there? But a lot of it is a product of the open market, and so there's only so much MPP or anyone else can do to kind of make sure that people have access to the open market and have access to obtaining a license, to be able to start, whether it's a cultivation center or a dispensary.
Okay. Now, Chicago has been probably the hardest hit city in Illinois in the war on drugs. Will the policies you're promoting also be able to support downstate cities, that marginalized communities like Cairo or East St. Louis, as you mentioned before? Will those policies primarily focus on Chicago because it's the hardest hit, or is it going to be a statewide effort?
Statewide effort. We plan on, the bill, the way we're constructing the bill, we want to make sure it's a statewide legalization bill, so we want to make sure not only with, as I mentioned before, the Restore Our Communities program, we want to make sure programs like that are effective in Chicago, Peoria, and East St. Louis, and Cairo as well. And, if there's an opportunity to provide training in those communities, we want to do that as well. Because this isn't just a Chicago problem. Obviously, Chicago gets a lot of attention because of the crime and violence, but, the war on drugs has impacted other places in the state. Springfield even, So we want to make sure we are cognizant of, this can't just be a Chicago thing. It is a statewide issue, and we want to help people across the state in any way we can. And, I think when you look at the expungement piece of it, that's something that would also, be able to, that would impact people statewide as well. It wouldn't just be if you're in the Chicago area and we're convicted, okay. Be anywhere you are. So.
Okay. And how do you respond to the critics who believe marijuana reparations policy is a reward for criminal behavior? You've kind of touched on that already, but how would you respond to those critics?
I think you have to balance that out. It's a really tough question, but I think I would respond by saying it's not one size fits all. You have to balance everything out, but it's hard for me to just say that their criticism is completely unwarranted. I think it depends on your perception of how you view the war on drugs. Do you view it from the perspective of the victim who, may have gone to jail for 30 years just because they were addicted to a substance, and that may have included cannabis possession somewhere along the way? Or do you view it from the perspective of, as I mentioned before, that you knowingly carried an illegal substance or tried to distribute a illegal substance, so why should you get preference over someone else? I mean, I just think it's kind of a philosophical debate, and I think cannabis legalization is one of the rare areas where we're starting to tackle some of these questions. And obviously, my position today may be, maybe we should take a closer look at this, but it could evolve eventually. I mean, I think anyone who's been involved in this process of legalization, I think their position constantly evolves. And if it hasn't, I think they're approaching it with a closed mind. And so when it comes to reparations and issues like this that, you could see both sides of it, I think you have to keep an open mind. And over time, I'm not going to sit here and say that my position can't evolve from where it is now, but, I think it's going to take time. So I think and that's a long way to answer your question, but I do think after more time and people have more time to process kind of, where this all ends up and where it's going, I think this will be kind of a constant back and forth.
Okay. And one more question for
Sure.
you. What do you see as, how do you see the prospects of the bills the expungement bills you're proposing and the larger hood incubator type project? What are the prospects for that actually going along with the legalization bill?
Yeah, I mean, I think we want to wrap it up all in one. I mean, there are a number of expungement bills that are currently out there and that have passed in the past year or so. So I think the way we view it is whatever hasn't been captured up to this point, we would like to include it in the legalization bill. Same with the hood incubator program. I think it goes kind of hand in hand. I think especially for members of the minority caucus, Black and Latino caucus, it's kind of unfair to ask them to vote for something that only includes, the profits and industry side of this and doesn't address the social justice issues and the restorative justice issues. So we see it as all in one. And I don't think, in our opinion, you can't move one piece without the other. So that's how I think if you ask me today or next week, I'm pretty positive that position will stay the same.
Have you heard a lot of positive feedback from legislators?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's always going to be mixed. You have those who think we should take a little more time. You have some who feel like we have sufficient evidence from places like Colorado and other places where legalization has passed. But I'll say overall, I do think we're starting to get a lot more positive feedback than I can even remember when the medical cannabis program passed here years ago. And, I think it's probably a product of the perception changing across the country. You can see that reflected in legislators here. So I do see it moving in a more positive direction. It's still a long way to go, though. I don't think it's a slam dunk by any means that, because there's still some legislators that are concerned and they don't think cannabis legalization is probably the best answer to correct some of the social injustices that are out there. So, and you got to respect their view on that. But, I think when you look at legalization, Illinois has already decriminalized cannabis. So legalization, I think, is the next logical step.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you. All right. So, so what? I mean, I kind of feel
Sorry, I didn't always put the question.
No. I can work with it.
Okay.
I was paying attention, and I think your answers still work.
Okay.
It seems like, I know it's probably not going to get done this session, obviously.
No.
There's too much going on. But do you think next session